book of Esther. I'm going to share a few things. We of course studied Esther in detail, but I just want to remind you of a few things tonight as we're going through the Bible, and I hope some of you are getting something out of these, and it's like I told you, it's good to understand how our Bible was put together, and we talked about the Bible and inspiration and revelation, all the different things, and then we're going through the book and seeing how it all works together, and give you an idea of maybe some things that you haven't read that much, and maybe pique your interest for some further study. And that's all this survey is meant to do, is to inform you a little bit, and also maybe educate you just a little tiny bit, and then encourage you to do further reading, or if you do read it, you'll have a little bit of an idea of what the book was all about. Not every Bible gives you some type of introduction about it. There's a lot of study Bibles that do, but just wanted to do a survey for you of the 66 books. The book of Esther. According to your outline that I wrote up, the author is unknown. Remember, as I told you when we looked at Ezra, that the events of Esther occurs between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the book of Ezra, dealing with the sovereignty and the faithfulness of God. What is unique about the book is that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, and so a lot of people will think of Esther being a secular book because of that. But as we know, his name is not mentioned, but he permeates the whole book. Esther is never quoted in the New Testament. There's a lot of scholars feel like that maybe Esther was the last of the Old Testament books written, because of some manuscripts and Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth. Esther is not there. So it could be the last of the, again, that's just speculation, but it could be. The purpose is to keep alive the memory, the preservation of the Jewish people. Central message and the theme, the providence of God, of course, the sovereignty of God and the sovereign accomplishment of God's purposes through ordinary people, and what we just happen to call coincidences or just chance or luck, so to speak. But God is behind the scenes throughout the whole book. One thing, the Feast of Purim, which is still a feast that is celebrated to this day, began here in the book of Esther. The personalities, and I'll just share a little bit about that. Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes in your secular history, it's Xerxes and Ahasuerus are the same person, who was the king of Persia. Queen Vashti, Mordecai, and Haman, and of course Esther. The structure of the book, the king's banquet, the first couple chapters, Haman's edict in chapter 3. Esther's courage is given to us in the 4th and 5th chapter, and God's deliverance of the Jewish people in the 6th and 7th chapter. And all of his providence is seen in chapters 8 through 10. The Jews are avenged, and the Feast of Purim is instituted, and so forth. Mordecai becomes the prime minister. So that gives you kind of a little brief outline of the book. I also included for you a copy of an outline that came from the Bible Knowledge Commentary, an outline that you can have, okay? Frederick Buechner, who is a scholar, he wrote this in a book called Wishful Thinking. He wrote this. In dealing with the sovereignty of God, and we think about God's sovereignty in such large things like in the creation of the universe and controlling and shaping of history and so forth. But listen to what he has to say about the sovereignty of God. I think of a person I haven't seen or thought of for years, and 10 minutes later I see her crossing the street. Ever happened to you? Or, just some individual. I turn on the radio to hear a voice reading a biblical story of jail, and which is a story that I have spent the morning writing about. A car passes me on the road, and its license plate consists of my wife's and my initials side by side. When you tell people stories like that, their usual reaction is to laugh, and one wonders why. I believe that people laugh at coincidence as a way of relegating it to the realm of the absurd and of therefore not having to take seriously the possibility that there's a lot more going on in our lives that we neither know or care to know. Who can say what is going on? But I suspect the part of it anyway is that every once and so often we hear a whisper from the wings that goes something like this. You've turned up in the right place at the right time. You're doing fine. Don't even think that you have been forgotten. You may have experienced that. God had not forgotten his exiled people. He enabled them to have the opportunity to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, as we talked about last week, and to rebuild their life as a holy nation. But there are some that chose to stay. They chose not to go back. Matter of fact, there are more who chose to stay than went back. Well, the events of Esther, again, occurs between the 6th and 7th chapter of the book of Ezra. It takes place between the exiles, the first return under Zerubbabel and the second return under Ezra. King Xerxes is ruling at the time, and his Hebrew name is Ahasuerus, as I mentioned to you. Okay. Esther's Hebrew name means myrtle. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, Hadassah, and it means myrtle, Myrtle, just like Myrtle Beach. And I understand myrtle was the name of a common, everyday bushy shrub. And then her Persian name is Esther, which means star. Star. And it's really appropriate because she is really the star of the book, if you will. And again, an outstanding feature of this book is the absence of any reference to God. Worship, prayer, sacrifice, there's a lot there. And again, a lot of people will think of this as being secular, and that has caused many to judge this book of having very little religious value. But on the contrary, those of you who went through the study with us know that, and those of you who've studied the book before know that that's not the case at all. Did the author deliberately refrain from mentioning God or any religious activity to heighten the fact that God is in control and that it is God that controls and directs in these what we would consider chances of luck or coincidences? And there's a lot of things that a lot of people discuss involving this book. God's sovereign rule was assumed at every point in the story of Esther. Even if there is no reference of him, he is there. And we talked about that in quite a bit of detail when we studied the book. Again, when you look at the main characters, you have Ahasuerus and Xerxes. And Xerxes was king of about 127 provinces that extended from India to Ethiopia. His kingdom was the ancient kingdom of the Persians. He was, at this particular time, maybe the most significant man in the world at this particular time. His reign took place during the era of the laws of the Medes and Persians, which you should be familiar with. It's a time of unprecedented dictatorship. Whatever the king said, his word was never, ever questioned. Never. He said it, his word was not questioned. And then there came a queen by the name of Vashti, his wife, the queen, Vashti. She was the king's first wife. She was the queen of the Persians. She was beautiful, a beautiful woman. As chapter 1, verse 11 tells us, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king, and the crown royal, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. So she was a beautiful woman. But she also was a woman of principle, who ended up losing her crown because she would not compromise her integrity. She refused to cooperate with the king's drunken demands that she would come in and display herself to all of his buddies, if you will. And she refused to do that. And so she was no longer queen. And then there's Haman, an anti-Semitic Persian who was promoted to a place of influential authority in the court of the king. Look at chapter 3, if you will. Look at chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gates, bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. That's who he was. Verse 10, same chapter. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. He was very conceited. He was money-hungry person. He was always looking out for nobody but himself. And that's who Haman was. And then we run across Mordecai. I've heard it pronounced Mordecai, and I've heard it pronounced Mordecai. Look at chapter 2, verse 5. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. A Jew, Mordecai, very righteous person. He had a very difficult job in the fact that he was rearing his uncle's daughter, whose parents had died, and this orphan was by the name of Hadassah. Look at verse 7. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. His uncle's daughter. So he had that chore of bringing her up and taking care of her. And this orphan, Hadassah, is best known as Esther. Esther. So you have the main characters here in the story, as you know. Again, these events that take place here in the book of Esther take place during the high part, or the zenith, if you will, of the Persian Empire. Remember, the Jews had gone into captivity under the Babylonians. And for 70 years, the Babylonians, who also you will read in the Bible, the Chaldeans, well, that's the Babylonians. That's the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. They're called the Chaldeans in the Old Testament. They ruled over the Jews. And the Babylonians were eventually overthrown by the Persians, as the Medes and the Persians had joined forces and swept the Babylonian Empire off the earth, if you will. And they took charge. Again, that's a part of history that you need to be familiar with when you think about this book. The Persians were kind to the Jews. And the king of Persia declared that the Jews could go back to their land if they wanted to. And so there's where we have the exiles, the three exiles that take place. One under Zerubbabel, one under Ezra, and one under Nehemiah, of course. But there were many Jews who chose to stay in Persia. And this story here, the book of Esther, is a story that takes place with the Jews who remain in Persia. Well, the book of Persia, the book of Esther, again, taking place during this time in Persia. You can look at it. I broke it down for you, but there are two main sections of this book. The providence of God is seen in the difficult times, and that's in the first 6 chapters. And then the providence of God in the happy times, and that is chapters 7 through 10. But all throughout the book is the providence of God. The book begins with a banquet. And many of you know that as we study that it was a banquet for the king. And there's a great deal of drinking that takes place and a lot of celebrating. And King Xerxes had called for Queen Vashti to be brought in and be paraded before these guests of his. And she refused to participate. And as a result, she lost her throne. And the king needed a queen He eventually realized, I don't have a queen, so I want a queen. And in response to that, I guess you have, like we have talent searches, you have a search for women to participate in a beauty contest, if you will. And that's what took place. There's a beauty contest to seek his new bride. And you could see God's hand at work in this. And Esther, this beautiful and godly Jewish lady, well, she wins the contest. And at the same time, there's a very influential leader in the king's court by the name of Haman, as we know. He is growing in power. He's wealthy. He's power hungry. He is a person that was very jealous, and he hated the Jews. He hated the Jews with a passion. He hated Mordecai most of all, because Mordecai would not bow down and give Haman the respect that was due him. And in his anger, Haman began a plot to destroy the Jews. And that is the beginning of the story. And Mordecai's refusal to pay homage to Haman, it angers him to the point that he wants to make the whole Jewish population pay. Look at chapter 3. We're going to read a couple of verses. Chapter 3, verse 2. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence him. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? And it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did reverence him, then was Haman full of wrath, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. And then if you read through verses 8 through 13, I won't take time to do that, but you see the same thing. So, word of this impending of the doom, it gets around, it spreads throughout the Jewish community. Look at chapter 4. When Mordecai had perceived that all was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry. And came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing. And many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The word gets around, and the people, as you might imagine, are so fearful. And Mordecai realized that the fate of his people hangs on the thread of Esther's relationship with the king. In chapter 3, verses 13 through 17, he asked her to do a very courageous thing. He asked her to stand before the king. God grants her the wisdom to devise a strategy, if you will, that will eliminate the arch enemy of her people. And look, I want you to look at something in chapter 5. Look at chapter 5. I think it's in verse 6. Yeah. Chapter 5, verse 6. Yeah. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, Why is this petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. What do you want? Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. She invites Haman, she invites the king to a banquet where the king has vowed to hear what is troubling the queen. You want to know what's bothering me? I'll tell you. And what is troubling her, and he will grant her wish. So Haman, again, this power-hungry and money-hungry individual that he is, he's elated at the invitation to go to this banquet. He goes by Mordecai again, and Mordecai acts like he's not even there. He doesn't bow to Haman again. And so Haman, well, he erects a gallows, which he plans to hang Mordecai. Look at chapter 5, verse 12. Haman said, Moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come into the king into the banquet, and that she said, I prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited to her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate, and he won't bow to me. And then Zeresh, the wife of Haman, says, and all of his friends, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. And tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou and merrily with the king into the banquet, with the king into the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. 75-foot gallows. So this man ain't going to bow to me, and I am going to get rid of him. Well, the king couldn't sleep. And there is an awareness that comes to him of something that Mordecai had done for him. And those of you remember the story. The past heroic effort that Mordecai had done for the king. He saved the king's life, what it boils down to. He saved the king's life. And there was a Chronicles. He couldn't sleep, so they couldn't find any copies of Pete's messages to put the king back to sleep. So they bring this Chronicles book, which has a list of things that take place. And there the king sees and is reminded of when Mordecai did something for him. He saved my life. He saved my life. And you read about that in the first 10 verses here. So he decides that in these verses that Mordecai should be exalted because of that. So instead of putting a noose around Mordecai's neck, Haman, make a long story short, Haman is the one who gets the noose around his neck. He comes to a royal banquet. He's very upset about the reversal of Mordecai's fate, and so he doesn't realize how much hot water he's in. And as they're there, Esther reveals the plot against her people. And the king asks the identity, and Esther points her finger to Haman. An event takes place, and it looks like that while the king steps out, comes back in, and he looks like that maybe Haman was trying to take advantage of Esther. And so the king sentences Haman to be hanged. And chapter 7, verse 10, and they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. And then that's basically the story. That's the story. Mordecai is promoted. God's people are taken care of. And again, you see God all working throughout the book in what we would think of the chances of luck or coincidences. Now, let me spend the balance of our time looking at a couple things. When you study the book of Esther, it's really a study of God's power, and it's a study of God's sovereignty. It's a study of the providence of God. What about the providence of God? Look at the book of Isaiah. Isaiah, and let me see, I want to go to the 55th chapter. Yeah. Isaiah 55. Very familiar verses. It's important to understand how mysterious God is if you ever want to make sense of the mysterious ways in which he works. In Isaiah 55, look down at verse 8. Again, very familiar passage. I just want to remind you of it. And think about his unsearchable judgments. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than earth, so are my ways higher than yours. And my thoughts than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts, he says. Go to the book of Romans. The 11th chapter. Again, I just want to remind you a couple things about the sovereignty and providence of God. Romans chapter 11. And look at verse 33. What about his ways, his unfathomable ways? Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways are past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord? Or who hath been his counselor? Who has known the mind of the Lord? Who became his counselor? He says. How unsearchable are his judgments. Unfathomable are his ways. That's the God of the universe. Now go back in the Old Testament to Daniel chapter 4. And I won't relive the story, but you know the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his sovereign control and what took place. But in Daniel chapter 4, look at verse 34. Nebuchadnezzar had gone through this illness, and Lord got his attention. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes into heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or can say unto him, What doest thou? What have you done? Nobody can say that. Or say to him, What have you done? What have you done? Again, these words come on the heels of a very humiliating period of time that took Nebuchadnezzar from insanity, if you will, to recovery. And he is someone who was very prideful. And he was stripped of his sanity and was made to see who really ruled heaven and who really ruled earth. And he found out real quick it wasn't him. Found out real quick it wasn't him. He was crushed under the mighty hand of God. And the king, as we read, he finally acknowledges God and his power. You think about the providence of God. The word provident is derived from the Latin word providere, and I know I'm not pronouncing it right because I've never had Latin, but P-R-O-V-I-D-E-R-E. You break it down, the first part, P-R-O, it means before, and the root word means I see. So, as the God of the universe, as the monarch over heaven and earth, God sees events before they happen. So that's what you talk about, the providence of God. He sees events before they happen. I see before. I see before. And he knows what's going to take place. He sees the future with 20/20 vision, if you will, with clarity. He's the one who works all things according to his perfect plan. Even when things in your life, when things in this world seem like they are out of hand or they're off course, we need to understand that God is there and that he is working behind the scenes. The seasons change and the nations rise and fall. Economies rise and fall. Nations rise and fall. But God never changes. From everlasting to everlasting, he is God. And we know because of that, his kingdom remains unshakable. Unshakable. So that's what you read and that's what you learn And that's what you should be really come to understand in the book of Esther, that God will have his way, and even though he may not be mentioned, even though he is invisible, he is in charge. He is in charge. There's times in our lives when we make a decision, and there may be a time when you stand alone in your commitment. People will come to those points and times in their lives, and some people may be finding themselves in that position right now. And it becomes a time of a lot of difficulty, and it comes a time of a test of individual courage, if you will. But we need to understand that we're not alone. And that's a tremendous lesson of Esther. She realized that she wasn't alone. It may be that it seems like God is doing something strange. There may be strange times in your lives. And he maneuvers things, he changes things, he alters things, he shifts various events. And you may wonder, why is it such a low tide in my life? Or why is this happening? Why is this happening when I was expecting this to happen? Why am I having such a difficult time when it looks like it was going to be easy? You ever had those things? Yeah. But you need to understand that a lot of us have seen that. Even when it's all over, we realize that God was leading us all along. He was leading all along. Anyway, there's a lot of lessons with the book of Esther. And as we all know, the providence of God, just by chance, right? Just by chance, this happened. Just by chance, that happened. All right. Bow your head with me, please. I don't know if you got anything out of this little brief survey tonight, but maybe it whets your appetite to revisit the story again and learn some of the some further aspects of the story, and just remember how all of it fits into the history of the Jewish people and again, how all of it fits into the story of how God had a plan for his people, and he was going to make sure that that plan came to fruition, as we know. A lot of lessons for us in the book of Esther. So I hope you can take the things and apply it. Dear God, as we come to you, we know, dear God, that in a survey like this, there's not a lot of things you can spend a lot of focus on, but we thank you for the book of Esther, and we thank you for the lessons that it teaches us. We look at the courage that was displayed and how you were there with them, and how you protected you protected your people throughout the journey. You allowed those to go back that wanted to go back to the homeland, and those who stayed, they weren't forgotten. And the book of Esther tells us that they weren't forgotten. So we thank you for the book of Esther, and we thank you for the valuable lessons that it teaches. as we give you the praise. Amen.